Since its publication in 1964, The Games People Play has become a surprise bestseller because it struck a responsive chord with its readers. Written for practicing analysts by psychiatrist Dr. Eric Bern, it explains in ordinary, understandable terms a startling theory of human relationships. Startling because of its simplicity. Dr. Bern's theory explains that the interplay between human beings can be understood in terms of the benefits that each receives. Called transactions, these games are one of several ways that we structure our relationships in order to keep our psychological distance from other people and prevent genuine intimacy. I'm David Prowett, science editor for National Educational Television. I visited Eric Bern at his home in Carmel on the California coast to discuss the applications of transactional analysis and the games people play.
Transactional analysis is a system of psychology for understanding human behavior, changing human behavior, and predicting human behavior.
Is a transaction the same as an interaction?
In some ways, we consider interaction to be a kind of a cowardly word because you don't commit yourself to anything by saying people are interacting. It's just a kind of a description. Transaction means that people are getting something out of it. Each person is getting something out of it, which goes back to the fundamental question of all social psychology, which is, why do people talk to each other?
What is the basic vocabulary that a layman needs to understand transactional analysis?
Basically, it's just 5 words. All of them, one or two have 2 syllables, but they're very everyday words. Parent, adult, child, game, and script. Recently, we've added another word which is assuming more and more importance, and that's what we call a contract, which means people should know what they're doing to each other and what their jobs are in relation to each other.
Right, the parent, adult, and child are ego states. Would you explain what the other 2 are?
Well, a game is a stereotype pattern of behavior. That is, it's something people keep doing over and over, and they may do it for years and years, every day or all day, and they don't even realize that it's a stereotype pattern. They may feel that it's sort of something they just want to do, or that it's spontaneous, but it's something that comes out the same way all the time. It's like, for instance, it may end in the person being angry or hurt or scared or feeling inadequate again and again throughout the day, and this is something which the person sets up. That's a game. Script is a lifelong plan, we might call it an unconscious life plan, which is decided in very early childhood, and if it's allowed to run its course, it will continue the way the person decided when they were 3, 4, or 5 years old, which is pretty young to make lifelong decisions, but that's the way life is. Actually, that's the way human beings are.
You really feel that the entire life is predestined from a script that's set that young?
Yes, unless something is done to change it. And I want to stress that because people get discouraged sometimes when I say that one's life course is determined by a decision that you make inside yourself at such an early age. But the point is there are things that can be done to change that decision. One of them happens to be psychotherapy. There are other things. So it's not...
it's not irrevocable at that.
That's right.
Does transactional analysis have to be done in group therapy then?
Well, it's presented as a group method because groups are where lots of transactions take place, and it's very helpful in group therapy. What happens is that people who study it and try it out in groups generally end up using it in their individual therapy also because they see that it works pretty well, and well, most people use it throughout their practices after a while.
How widely is it spread in this country?
I think we have now 500 members in our association. It's spread widely enough so that we had to organize, much against our inclinations, because we don't believe in organizing things too highly. So there are about 500 members. I think we have members in about half the states of the Union. We also have a small branch in Costa Rica. We have some people in England. And recently, the most interesting development has been a branch in Hawaii, where it is being used.
As we've been talking, one thing has been bothering me. You talk about ego states, this parent-child and adult relationship. it sounds a little like a description of schizophrenia. Does it have any connection at all?
No, there isn't. What happened was that many years ago, in the early 1900s, somebody began to talk about split personality and related that to schizophrenia. But that was done in a very technical sense, which most people would find it hard to understand. But the expression got around, and then people began to think split personality means something bad. Actually, everybody has a split personality because every human being has at least 3 different people in his head.
It's a question of how well they're integrated.
That's right.
All right, well, let's get down to cases. What's the first thing that happens when a patient walks into your office?
First thing is to find out why he's there. What does he want? And then I try to see what I have to offer him. And that goes back to the word contract that I mentioned before. In other words, I want to know what he wants from me, what I can do for him, or what I can cure him of. And then after we've talked a while, he gets an idea of what I have to offer. And in that way we can come, we hope, to an agreement to go ahead with trying to help him.
I'm still not sure that I understand the term contract. Is every relationship between adults the establishing of a contract?
I would say so. I think a lot of trouble in the world comes from what we would call unclear contracts, which means people aren't sure how they relate to each other or what they're allowed to do or say to each other. And if they transgress these unspoken limits, there's very often trouble. So a clear contract, I think, helps in any relationship, and we feel, when I say we, I mean these other colleagues that we talked about a few minutes ago, we feel that the first thing in any treatment situation is a clear contract in the sense of what does the patient want and what can we do for him.
Can both of you understand this?
We should both understand very clearly about that.
Well, does the patient actually state his contract with you, or is this a conclusion you have to reach after talking with him?
Sometimes he is, sometimes he isn't, and at other times there's a third kind of people who come from, let's say, other kinds of therapy where they have a kind of contract which involves words that we don't like to use very much. They're sort of sentimental or unclear words like relationship, personality, dependency, and we don't really feel we know what they mean. So sometimes a patient will state what we call his side of the contract in those terms, like I want to have better relationships, and then we say, well, what is a relationship? And we finally try and boil it down to something very specific where we will know and he will know whether he is actually accomplishing what he set out to do in the treatment.
Since a contract is between 2 parties, does that mean that the analyst has to commit to the patient too?
Right.
You do feel that there is a commitment?
Yes, we have a very strong commitment to say we accept the patient's contract if he says it clearly enough. For instance, we may say, oh, then what you want to be cured of are migraine headaches. Well, let's see what we can do. And we may end up let's say that session by saying, okay, now you've had a chance to listen to me for a while, and that's the sort of thing I have to offer, so if you want to continue, fine, let's go.
Would you say that this is analogous to directive analysis then, as opposed to non-directive?
Not really. I think all we're trying to do there is we're not trying to direct the patient, all we want to do is find out what the patient wants. Like sometimes I say, I'm running a psychiatry store, what do you want? Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's directive. I think it's direct, but not directive.
Transactional analysis seems to demand more from the patient than other forms of analysis. He really has to know his condition to make it work, doesn't he?
Yes, that is true. He has to find out what really goes wrong.
Not necessarily before he comes in.
No.
But he must know it before the analysis can begin.
That's right, because that's the only way we really will ever know whether we're accomplishing what he wants or what we started out to do, is if it's clear what we're supposed to be doing.
Do the patients really know that much about their case?
Bodily complaints are usually pretty clear. A migraine headache is something the patient knows he has, and he knows where it is, and then he knows all about it in great detail. But it's very easy to reduce many conditions to, let's say, physiology, which is very, very important. The body is really here to stay, and it is a very important part also of psychological functioning and psychological problems. For example, what people call trouble with relationships. If we really look into it, what he really means is, in physiological terms, something like when I go into a room where there are strange people, I feel funny. And then you say, where do you feel funny? And he may know very well, right in the pit of my stomach. And then we know that whatever is something in that situation is affecting his stomach. So that's what's got to be cured.
And he's actually getting a physiological reaction.
Right. There's always a physiological reaction to an emotional situation.
Well, I know that you believe in talking over the patient's illness with the patient. Is this generally accepted practice in analysis?
I think we carry it a little farther than most people. For example, one thing we've been doing lately is having the staff conference in the presence of the patient, even with adolescents. And it works very well. Most people, let's say most other clinicians, for instance, the hospital staff, are a little uneasy about it the first couple of times. But when they discover how beneficial it is to the patients and how the patients pull themselves together, no matter how disturbed they are ordinarily, if they're told this is a staff conference about you and it's your privilege to listen to it, it's amazing how, as we would say, their adult gets hooked, and no matter how oddly they were behaving before, they will sit quietly for an hour and listen very, very intelligently to an intelligent, open discussion of their own case.
You don't find that it frightens them in any way?
I've never known it to frighten them in my experience.
How do you translate the theories and the contracts you've made into a coherent plan for therapy?
Well, let's take as a sort of a theoretical example, a man who comes in and talks about relationships, and we discover what he really means is when he goes to a party where there are strangers, his stomach feels funny. Well, the first thing we do is talk about parent, adult, and child. In that case, it's very obvious that it's the child part of him that feels funny because at an adult level or at an objective level, nobody at the party is going to hurt him or wants to hurt him. There's nothing to be afraid of. So then we trace that back and discover that is so. See, if we say something as your child, that's only our opinion. And in order to verify it, we have to go through certain procedures. One of them is to find out, did you really feel that way when you were actually a child? And if he did, then we say, well, our diagnosis is right. That's the child part of you. So it's very easy to trace back in such cases that the same thing happened when he went to kindergarten the first day or when he went to birthday parties. So we set up the child and the adult, and then it's a little more difficult, but not too difficult, to establish that it's something about the way his parents raised him which contributed to his child being scared in that situation. For instance, they may have been hammering at him, watch your manners, to take a very simple example. He goes to the party and he's scared that he may do something rude, and his parents would be angry at him, and then let's say all the other kids are going to have better manners than he has, and so they'll jump on him, and that scares him. So in that way, we set up the parent, adult, child first. Then the next step would be to talk about some of the transactions with other people, because those people who go to parties feeling frightened are somehow going to get themselves scared. If nobody goes out of their way to scare them, they'll set something up. They have to, as we would say, they have to collect a scared stamp. So we find out by taking some examples, how does he go about having somebody scare him? And that's what we would call the transactions he goes through. And then if you add them all together, you have essentially a game, which in this case might be called Kick Me, in which he comes on so strongly, scared, as though saying, please don't kick me, that it's almost as though he were wearing a sweatshirt, and so we speak of sweatshirts. So a sweatshirt says, please don't kick me. Well, I think it would be interesting for somebody to actually put on a sweatshirt saying, please don't kick me, and go to a party and see what would happen. I think it's very obvious what would happen. Everybody would take a kick at him. So he gets himself kicked, and that's the game.
Dr. Bern, we've been talking about life plans as such. Just what are they?
That's where the word script comes in. That's what is decided when people are very small, maybe 4 or 5 years old. And then they don't quite know how to go about it, and I think that the next thing they latch onto is usually a fairy tale, which sounds like the way they want things to be.
You mean a real fairy tale?
The real fairy tale. And so very often we can find out what a person's script is by asking, what is your favorite fairy tale? And so as we walk around, they're looking at people. There are innumerable Prince Charming, Cinderella's, Sleeping Beauties, Rapunzels, and youngest of 3 sons who's going to be smarter than the other 2, and like that.
Get it. After all, should let her hair down.
What I'd like to talk about is the Rapunzel script, which is a little bit different. The case in question is a woman who got married and thought this guy's a loser, and someday the real prince will come along. She had been adopted by her grandmother when she was young, and her grandmother broke up the marriage and then made trouble when the boyfriend came along who was supposed to be the real prince. And the result was that the girl began to have diarrhea, and she came to the therapist, and the therapist had a lot of trouble with her because she obviously didn't want to give up her symptom. However, what I want to talk about is the Rapunzel script in general. The story of Rapunzel is that she's taken away by a witch at birth and put in a tower without any door, and then she has to lower her hair for the witch to climb up into the tower. And then one day a prince comes by and he sees what's happening, so he says, gee, pretty good, so I'll try it. So Rapunzel lets the prince climb up using her hair as a ladder. And as the fairy tale in Grimm says, she consented to have him for her husband. And so he would climb up there, and she said, why don't you bring a little bit of thread with you every time you come, and pretty soon we'll have a ladder. So she collects a lot of thread, and then one day she says to witch, pardon me, gee, you sure are lighter than the prince that climbs up my hair every day. And the witch says, prince? What prince? And then the trouble begins, and Rapunzel gets banished, and then the witch cuts her hair off, and the prince climbs up the hair as usual, but when he gets up there, the witch is there, and she puts his eyes out and sends him out into the wilderness, and he wanders, and pretty soon, being a few years later, he hears a familiar voice, and it's Rapunzel, and his sight comes back, and they live happily ever after. Now, at first sight, in the case that I mentioned, it looks as though the husband is not a prince, he's a loser, and the later boyfriend is the real prince. But if we think over the real script of Rapunzel, what's going on is that Rapunzel is really getting tired of the prince. So as soon as she gets tired of him, she says that to to the witch rather, and the witch, of course, knows it all along. She's not that stupid, but that's the signal, so she says essentially, I'll get rid of him for you. So she sends Rapunzel out into the wilderness and takes care of the prince. Now, while listening to this case history in some detail, I was certain that this girl really wanted to end up back with her grandmother, and that's why she was hanging on to her symptom. And that's what Rapunzel really wanted. She wanted to get rid of the prince so she and grandmother could start all over again and con another prince. Then if we look at the prince's script, he's a loser because any winner who found a girl with long blonde hair that she lowers out of a tower and he climbs up and he loves her is going to get her out of there real fast, and if he can't get her out of there, he's going to give her a few hints like, better not tell the witch. And Rapunzel couldn't have been that stupid anyway that she didn't know what she was saying. So the prince's script evidently is that he's a loser and he wants to get into trouble, and so he arranges so he gets his eyes put out. So you have to be very careful in talking about patient scripts that you don't assume that princes are winners because in the actual fairy tales they don't turn out to be very bright. So the moral is, when you think you know the patient's script, that is the patient's unconscious life plan, you have to be very careful that you don't make a mistake by being too naive. Does anybody have any?
How come Rapunzel had to go with all the princes?
Well, the main thing Rapunzel wanted to do was stay with grandmother and have a little fun in between, so she would pick up an occasional prince, like she would let her hair grow again, I think, and run through the whole thing over again. But always she has to have grandmother, because grandmother's her real protection from man.
Why is it that you had to go into such a complicated allegory as Rapunzel to explain what was happening in Elise's case?
What we're trying to do is predict the whole life course of a person, which can't be too simple. And what we find is that most people's lives follow very closely the pattern of a fairy tale. That's why fairy tales stick with people, because they're very meaningful in some way. And so Rapunzel may sound complicated, but as a story of a whole lifetime, actually, it's relatively simple. And so we feel that people really try to live out a fairy tale in all its details. The only difficulty is that the fairy tale ends where they get married and live happily ever after, and our problem is, okay, what happens after they get married? Which is not always that they're happy.
Do you feel this helps you to understand it better and to communicate it to your colleagues?
That's right. And also the patients seem to understand that very well. They can see, for example, the Rapunzel case that I presented, it was not the therapist's idea that this is Rapunzel. The patient said, gee whiz, this is Rapunzel.
Really?
As though she could see that that's what she'd been doing all her life, and then she knew the rest of the fairy tale, and her reaction was, that's probably what I'm going to do, just what Rapunzel did. I'm going to end up in some kind of a wilderness, and my best boyfriend is going to end up in trouble, and it's all due to the old witch, who in this case was grandmother. So it's the patient, actually, who tells us, just as in all these things. For instance, the question of permission not to follow the script. The script is an injunction from mother or father at a very early age. And the question of permission was solved for me, not in my head, but by a patient. It was a gambler. And the question was, how could I induce him or somehow persuade him not to gamble? And he said, that isn't the problem. All you have to do is give me permission not to gamble, because I feel that somebody in my head is telling me I have to gamble. And that was a revelation to me. I sort of sat up in my chair and said, wow, this is interesting. And then by listening to other patients, I discovered it's not that I have to tell them what to do. I merely have to give them permission to disobey let's say, the destructive orders which were given to them by one or other parent. And we know a lot about how the parents work. For instance, it is the parent of the opposite sex who tells the child what to do at a very early age, and the parent of the same sex who shows the child how to do it. One of our classical examples is the beautiful girl. Now, a beautiful girl, in our way of thinking, is a girl whose father gave her permission to be beautiful by saying, you're beautiful, I like beautiful girls, your mother's beautiful, that's what I like. And then mother shows her how. That means mother shows her how to dress, how to act, how to walk.
Be a girl.
How to be a girl. And inversely with a man. Mother says, this is what I want you to be, and father shows him how to go about being it. And this principle seems to work very well. So that's why if we can find the fairy tale, which somehow is the story of the person's life, or if the person can find it themselves, then it really gives them a feeling that they know something about where they're going and what has to be headed off.
I think the music has finally gotten to me. I can no longer hear you anymore.
Yeah, what a noisy here.
What contributes to real love between a man and a woman?
Well, that we don't pretend to know, because Usually people who are capable of real love don't seem to end up coming to psychiatrists. They seem to be finding their own happiness, and they don't have to...
Well, Dr. Bern, where do you expect transactional analysis to go?
Well, I think that someday somebody is going to discover what human living is all about. For example, my feeling is that Freud set the foundation. I think that we have built something on the foundation. Sometime in the future, somebody will build, let's say, a third story on what we have done. And I think the answer is in script. That is, the the plan for a lifelong career which each person acquires at a very early age, maybe 4 or 5 years old. It may not be too specific in grown-up terms, but in general it's like, I will be a success, or I will be a failure, or I'm going to end up killing myself, I'm going to end up killing somebody. So by finding out a person's plans for his whole career, his whole life, and in careers we include such things as failure, ending in suicide, ending in psychosis or confinement in a state hospital, that if we can get in there and break that up, then we can really change a person's whole life course, and we feel we might really have found a very valuable secret of human behavior, a very long-term secret, which involves not only the person, but also his children. If we can break that up, we're extending the treatment into future generations, which of course every psychiatrist would like to do. If we can find a way to counteract the instructions people receive as very young children as to how they go the rest of their lives, that then we will really have something very valuable. Somebody says hello enthusiastically and you don't answer very enthusiastically, then they feel cheated. It's almost as though they had a kind of a little machine or cash register in their head that was figuring out how much hello you said and how much they owe you back. So that's why we call it a transaction, is because if A says something and B answers, then they're both getting something out of it, or they wouldn't bother to say it. In other words, the basic question of all social interchanges between people is, why do people talk to each other? Why do they bother to?
And you're constantly evaluating while this is going on and getting something from it.
You mean the speakers are evaluating what they get out of it? I think so. They don't really stand there making estimates, but the estimates are made sort of automatically, and people feel disappointed if, pardon me, if they don't get what they want, and they may also be a little curious if they get more than they bargained for.
Well, are all interactions transactions? Is this the only way that people spend their time together?
Well, we've found that talking about what people can do when they're together in a room, as we would say, or together in a car. How are they going to spend their time? And our explorations indicate that there are just 6 different ways that people can do that. The first way is that they can withdraw from each other. That is, a person may be there in body but not in mind, which is the old Tom Sawyer situation where the boy's in the schoolroom but his mind is out at the old swimming hole, and for all practical purposes he's not in the schoolroom. And that we call withdrawal. That's one thing people can do. The second is what we call rituals. A ritual is a very standardized series of exchanges which doesn't convey any information, but as kind of an act of recognition. Like hello, hello, or what's new, or how are things, and looks like rain, like, and it doesn't really, the content of what's said doesn't really mean very much. It's just the fact that the people are recognizing each other, and And that's that makes people feel good, and that's healthy.
And the answers are all standardized.
They tend to be pretty well standardized. For instance, if I say to you, looks like rain, and you're supposed to answer yes, and if you answered no, that would throw us off, and we'd have to kind of do a double take and figure out what kind of a conversation to have. But if you just say yes, then you're really saying to me, yeah, you're okay, and we move on to the next exchange. So the answers are standardized. Then the next step is, after people have gone through rituals, is what we call pastimes, which are not quite as standardized as rituals, but they give the person a feeling, perhaps, that they're saying something that they really mean or that's original, but actually they are fairly well standardized. Our classical example is a pastime called General Motors, which people play at cocktail parties or wherever they may be.
What's that one?
Well, that's, one guy says, I like a Ford Chevrolet or Plymouth, and you choose one, better than a Ford Chevrolet or Plymouth, and you choose one, because, and then you complete in 25 words, and then the other guy says, oh yeah, but I like, and he chooses one of the three, and completes his sentence in 25 words. There are various pastimes. If you go to a cocktail party, generally the people get off in corners, and in each corner they're playing one pastime. For instance, the young mothers are off in the corner playing what we call PTA, like how do you bring up children. And actually there are two kinds of PTA. There's the kind that says, what's the matter with children? And then there's the kind that says, am I a good mother? And usually those two kinds don't mix, like they tend to stay in separate corners at the cocktail party.
Right.
Well, those are what we call pastimes. Nothing really much is happening. It's kind of a polite exchange of opinions. After people play pastimes for a while, they can go off in two directions. One would be an activity, what people ordinarily call work. That is, doing arithmetic, talking about factual things, about how to bring up children, for example. Building a boat. That's another thing people can do when they're in a room together or in a place together. Or they can go into games. Games is where the action begins. Pastimes are just what they sound like, just a way of filling in the time while you get acquainted with people. But games are real action. People get real satisfactions out of them. Usually the satisfactions are rather odd and possibly even gruesome. They don't sound like satisfactions, but the reason people play games is that they get certain satisfactions from it. Satisfactions are things like guilt feelings, anger, hurt feelings, fear, feelings of inadequacy, and it seems strange that people would want to get those feelings, but they do. After games, the next step would be a game-free relationship, which we call intimacy. People have been trying to define intimacy for really 5,000 years, and I think we've come about as close as anybody. We say intimacy is a game-free, candid, frank relationship. I don't mean by this sexual intimacy, because sex could fit into any of these categories. For instance, as everybody knows, there's ritualistic sex and there's pastime sex. By intimacy, we mean more just the way it's defined, a game-free relationship in which people are talking straight to each other. And that's the best kind, and everybody has a kind of hunger for intimacy. But they're also afraid of it. It's really very scary. And one of the functions of games is to get a degree of intimacy without getting too close. So games are, on the one hand, a barrier against intimacy, because games are kind of underhanded and they're exploiting people, and that's the opposite of intimacy. In intimacy, nobody's exploiting anybody. But on the other hand, games do give a certain kind of closeness, which may be all that most people can stand. Now, the point about these 6 ways of structuring time is, that interests us in our research work is, that as far as we know, Those are the only 6 ways there are. For instance, we might say to somebody now, you two have to talk to each other or sit beside each other, and you must have no rituals, no activities, no pastimes, no games, and you mustn't withdraw. And then see what they come up with. And the only thing they can come up with is the 6th one, which is intimacy. So that's one way to get people to get intimate very quickly. And it's also a way to demonstrate how scary intimacy is to most people.
Then the 6 ways of structuring time are rituals, pastimes, activities, games, intimacy, and if all else fails, withdrawal. Now, this coast is just absolutely beautiful. In the midst of all this, it's sort of hard to think of all bad games. Is there any such thing as a good game?
Well, existentially, all games are bad because they involve a con and they're not straight. But some games seem to end up pretty well for both parties. For instance, the game of Cavalier is one of those, where the man pays the girl extravagant compliments as though he were really interested in her, but what he's really interested in is making the compliments poetic. So he feels good and she feels good and no harm done. Or in the busman's holiday game, where the man says, I'm really over here just on a holiday, but I kind of want to help you with your work, and there's a con there because actually he planned to help the other fellow with his work before he ever started out. So everybody feels pretty good. And I suppose in that sense, those are good games.
You use the word con and payoff. Is there a definite structure in every game?
Right. The thing that I'm very anxious for get across to you, Dave, is that a game is something very specific. It's not just something that people do over and over. It has to have 3 characteristics: a con, a gimmick, and a payoff. Now, the con is a kind of a cheating, where the person says, I'm trying to do one thing, but they're really trying to do something else. This is in the old con game, where the con man would say, I'm here to help you make some money, but he was really there to take the guy's money away. The gimmick is the weakness which makes the other person play the game. For example, in the game of I'm only trying to help you, the person who plays that has a weakness for helping people. And so if you want to con them, you have to say, I need help, and then you got them hooked. That's the gimmick that you hook them with. And the payoff is the feelings that people get out of playing the game. We call those trading stamps. For instance, in the good games I described, we would say both parties got gold trading stamps. That is, they both felt good. In most games, the object is to get a bad feeling, oddly enough. It sounds like a weird thing to say, but that's what people play games for, is to get a bad feeling, like guilt or inadequacy or hurt feelings, and we call that a dirty brown trading stamp. That's their payoff.
Some payoffs are pretty gruesome. Suicide, alcoholism. Is there anything that transactional analysis can do, say in the case of alcoholism?
Well, we have a lot of our people who work in alcoholic clinics or clinics where they treat alcoholics, and we think we're really doing something rather interesting there. One of our aims, for example, is to cure the alcoholic so that if he wants to, he can drink socially. We don't say he has to drink socially, but the real cure would be, of an alcoholic, would be where the individual can drink socially, and we have many cases like that, I would say.
What happens when you have a case of an alcoholic, for instance? Obviously, something is behind the alcoholism. What happens when you take his game away?
Well, he has to find something else to do. That's what the problem that particularly so-called alcoholics run into is if they stop drinking, then they don't know what else to do, and they have an awful time filling their day in with things that interest them. They have a hard time finding action because they used to get their action from whatever happened while they were drinking.
How do you know that an alcoholic is cured, for instance?
When he stops drinking, the cured alcoholic is like anyone who's cured of playing games. The games are like a lot of trash in people's minds, and if they can get rid of those, we hope they come out fresh and they start seeing things again, maybe things they haven't seen since they were children, like ocean, birds, trees, and we're not, of course, sure that that's actually what happens, but that's what our contract is essentially. But if you get rid of the games and come on straight, you'll get better. And so far it seems to work.